At 4:10 in the morning, in the alley behind a brewery, Nyasa Corrigan was shoveling wet grain into a borrowed trailer by the light of her phone. It was February. The grain came out of the mash tun, still warm, steaming in the cold, and it weighed more than anything that looks like porridge has any right to weigh. Better than a ton by the time she was done, shoveled by hand, one scoop at a time, into a trailer with a bad axle, hitched to a car she was still paying off. She had been laid off in November. She had $400, a commercial kitchen certificate, and no plan that anybody she loved considered a plan. The brewer, a man named Dermot, came out at 4:30 with 2 coffees and watched her work for a minute. "You know I have to pay a man to take that," he said. "I know," Nyasa said, not stopping. "That's why I'm here. Every brewery in the world has this problem, and almost nobody outside the industry knows it exists. To make beer, you soak crushed malted barley in hot water and draw off the sugary liquid. What's left behind, the soaked, spent grain, is about 80% of everything that goes into the brewhouse by weight, and it comes out wet, heavy, and perishable. A small brewery makes a couple of tons of it a week. A big one makes that in a shift. And it is, by any measure the brewery cares about, garbage. It's too heavy to store. It starts to sour within a day or two in summer, and it takes up space they need. Most breweries give it away to a farmer for animal feed. A lot of them pay somebody to haul it off. Nobody was hiding it. It sat there behind every brewery in the country, thousands of pounds a week, free to anyone who showed up with a trailer. She was not a farmer, and she had no interest in feeding it to cows. She had spent 19 years on the line, 6 of them running the kitchen at a hotel restaurant that closed the way those places close, with 2 weeks' notice and a manager who couldn't look anybody in the eye. 19 years of standing at a station, knowing to the gram what things cost, because that's the whole game in a kitchen. Food cost is the difference between a restaurant and a hobby. So when a friend who worked weekends at Dermot's brewery mentioned in passing that they were paying to get rid of the mash, Nyasa did not hear waste. She heard a number, and the number was 0. Spent grain is malted barley that's had its sugar rinsed out. What's left is the husk, the protein, and the fiber, and to a cook that reads as flour that's already been cooked once, with more protein and about 4 times the fiber of the white flour she'd been buying in 25-kilo sacks her entire career. The reason nobody baked with it was not that it doesn't work. It's that it comes out of the tun soaking wet and starts to spoil almost immediately, and drying it costs money and effort that no brewery has any reason to spend. That was the whole problem. That was the only problem. Her first attempt at solving it was a domestic oven, and it was a disaster. She spread that first ton of wet grain, a ton, in a rented flat with a shared back garden, across every baking tray she owned, and dried it at the lowest setting her oven would hold. It took 11 hours. It scorched at the edges and stayed damp in the middle. The flat smelled like a brewery for a week, which her neighbor mentioned twice. What came out of it, ground in a second-hand grain mill, was maybe 15 kilos of usable flour from 1,000 kilos of raw material, and it tasted burnt. The second batch she air-dried on racks. It went moldy on day 2. She threw away more than she kept for 3 months. And she kept notes on all of it. Moisture, time, temperature. In a school copybook, because she had been running kitchens long enough to know that the difference between cooking and guessing is whether you write it down. The thing that finally worked was not clever. It was a used commercial dehydrator, the kind places use for fruit, bought at auction for €900 she genuinely did not have, run in a corner of a rented industrial unit that cost her most of the rest. Tell me where you're watching from. I like knowing how far these travel, and I read them all. And if you've ever been laid off and had to make something up from nothing, you already know the part of this story that comes next. By the following autumn, she had a process that ran. Collect the grain hot within 2 hours of the mash. That mattered, because the clock on spoilage starts the moment it leaves the tun. Press out the free water. Dehydrate to a moisture level she could measure rather than guess at. Mill, sieve, bag. A ton of wet spent grain came out the other end as roughly 140 kilos of dry flour, and the whole input cost her diesel and hours. Then she did the thing that separated her from everyone who'd ever had this idea in a pub and never gone any further. She didn't try to sell flour. She was a cook, so she baked. She turned that flour into crackers. Dark, seeded, snappable things that tasted like the inside of a good loaf. Because a bag of flour is a commodity you have to explain to people, and a cracker is something a person can eat standing in front of you at a market stall and decide about in 4 seconds. She took them to a Saturday food market in November with a folding table and 1,100 packets she'd made in a rented kitchen over 4 nights. She sold 312 packets that first day and stood there afterward, feeling something she hadn't felt in a year, which was competent. The part that mattered more happened at about 2 in the afternoon. A woman who bought a packet came back 40 minutes later with her husband and bought 6 more. And while she was paying, she asked whether Nisa supplied to shops, because she managed one. Nisa said yes. She did not at that point supply to shops. She spent that night working out what it would cost to, and the following Tuesday, she walked into that shop with a price list she'd made in a spreadsheet at 3 in the morning. 2 years in, she was collecting from 4 breweries instead of 1, in a second-hand refrigerated van instead of a trailer with a bad axle. She had 3 staff. One of them was a woman who'd been made redundant from the same hotel kitchen on the same day as Niesa. The crackers were in 91 shops. She'd added a second product because the first one taught her what people actually bought, and a third because a customer kept asking for it. And Dermot, the brewer who'd come out with 2 coffees at 4:30 in the morning, had stopped charging anybody to haul his mash because Nisa was taking all of it, and he'd started putting her product on the bar in his taproom, where a pint of his beer and a packet of crackers made from the grain of that same beer turned out to be a thing people found delightful. That was not a marketing plan either of them wrote down. It was just what happened when 2 people, who each had something the other needed, kept turning up. In year 3, it nearly went under, and she is straightforward about this when people ask her to tell the story at conferences, which they do now. She took on a distributor contract that was too big. It required volume she could only hit by running the dehydrators around the clock, and the margin on it was thin enough that a single bad month would eat the year. Then a heat wave in July spoiled 2 collections before she could process them. A dehydrator motor burned out, and she missed a delivery window. The distributor cut the order. She had product she'd made for them and nowhere to put it. Staff she couldn't reduce without breaking something she cared about, and a business loan with her name on it. She got through it by selling the surplus at cost to anyone who'd take it. By Dermot, letting her run 3 months behind on nothing at all, because he wasn't charging her anything in the first place. And by working the kind of hours that are not admirable, and that she doesn't recommend to anyone. She'd tell you the lesson isn't never take a big contract. It's that free raw material doesn't make you invincible. It just means your risk sits somewhere other than the input cost. 5 years on, the company turns over a little over €2 million a year. That number gets quoted a lot, and it deserves to be broken open, because turnover is not profit, and Niisa is the first to say so. Out of that comes 11 salaries, a leased unit, 4 vans, machinery she now maintains on a schedule, packaging, insurance, and the fact that food manufacturing runs on margins that would make a software person laugh out loud. What she has built is not a fortune. It is something better and rarer than that, a real business. That makes a real thing, that employs 11 people in a town where jobs like that don't get created very often, out of a raw material that 300 breweries in that country are still, today, paying somebody to take away. She processes about 700 tons of spent grain a year now. It is a rounding error against what the industry produces. That's the part she finds funny, and also the part that keeps her up. The woman from the hotel kitchen, the one made redundant on the same day, runs production now and has a title she chose herself and thinks is funny. 2 of the 11 came through a back-to-work scheme and had been out of employment for over a year each. Nisa doesn't make a thing of that in interviews and got mildly annoyed when a magazine tried to. She says the reason she hires people who've been out a while isn't charity. It's that she was one of them in November 5 years ago, and she knows exactly how much work somebody will do to prove they're still worth something. Dermot's brewery and her unit share a wall now. They didn't plan that either. A unit came up beside his and she took it, and there's a roller door between them that's open most days, and the mash comes through it warm. The alley behind that brewery looks the same as it did the February morning she stood in it with a shovel and a phone light and a trailer with a bad axle. Same bins, same steel tanks through the doorway, same steam coming off the grain when it comes out of the tun, still warm in the cold at 4:10 in the morning. The only difference is that now there's a roller door in the wall, and the grain goes through it instead of out to a skip, and on the other side of that wall, there are 11 people whose wages come out of the thing. Everybody in that industry had agreed, for about 400 years, was the part you throw away.